Reading for Gaza. The destruction of Palestine is the destruction of the earth, part 4 or 5. I lost track. But previously we were talking about Egypt and how steam power kind of affected Egyptian trade routes in the 1800s, I believe, and how the British, with their steam power, were able to overdo industry propped up by their, I guess, dictator at the time in the region, Muhammad Ali. So yeah, watch the previous video to get more detail on that. This section is called Palestine Delivered. Not sure how far we're going to read. I didn't bring water with me, so it might be another shorter one today. But last night was really fun. I had a good time listening to Frank Ocean's album, what is it, Orange? The song Pyramids. Peak. And coincidence, we were just talking about Egypt. Anyway, Palestine Delivered. The second country whose fate was cast in stone at this time was Palestine. In 1840, the British Empire first proposed its colonization by Jews. More precisely, on 25th November, Palmerston wrote to Ponsonby, the ambassador in Istanbul, "This is a great triumph to us all. The fall of Akka, a few weeks old, especially to you, who always maintained that Mehmet's power would crumble under a European attack." And then he went on. So I think it's important, as you read this, to note the history. So it's this was in 1840s, so about 100 years before the UN established the State of Israel. It was already, this area was going to be seen as a colony for Jewish people. But I think it's important to know that history. Anyway, and then he went on, "Pray, try to do what you can about these Jews. You have no idea to what extent the interest felt about them goes. It would be extremely politic, if we could make the Sultan give them every encouragement and facility for returning and buying lands in Palestine. And if they were allowed to make use of our consuls and ambassador as a channel of complaint, that is to say, place themselves virtually under our protection, they would come back in considerable numbers and bring with them much wealth." So, yeah, they wanted it to be like a colonial outpost for them, which I think is exactly what how America is treating Israel now, as a colonial outpost in the region. 57 years before the First Zionist Congress, 77 years before the Balfour Declaration, 107 years before the Partition Plan, the chief architect of the British Empire near the summit of its power here laid down the formula for the colonization of Palestine. For some reason, this particular document appears to have never been cited in the entire historiography, but it is all there, encapsulated in a missive sent in the euphoria following the pulverization of Akka. The year 1840 saw the first mania for what we now know as the Zionist project. It had been in the making for a few years. As is fairly well known, Britain in the late 1830s saw a wave of Christian Zionism, the doctrine that Jews must be gathered and restored to Palestine, where they will convert to Christianity and precipitate the second coming of Christ and usher in the Last Judgment. So that's what a lot of American Zionists are, who are not Jewish. A lot of them are Christian Zionists who generally believe that all the Jews need to go back in Israel and then it will bring about the second coming of Christ. Which, I mean, that sounds very anti-Semitic to me, especially when you get into, like, they believe that a third of Jews will go to hell and a third will go to heaven. Yeah, it's wild for me to wrap my head around, but, I mean, millions of people believe it. The main evangelist of this gospel was the Earl of Shaftesbury, who was related through marriage to Lord Palmerston. He tried to make the most of this family bond, but when he spoke to the Foreign Secretary, he had to put his religious arguments to one side. Instead, he peppered him with reports about the productive powers of the Holy Land, being for centuries altogether neglected. If only Britain resolved to insert the Jews into it, Palestine could be turned into a supplier of raw cotton and a market for manufactured goods, and our capitalists might be tempted to invest large sums in machinery and cultivation. After dinner with Palmerston on 1st August 1840, the godly but shrewd Shaftesbury noted in his diary, "I am forced to argue politically, financially, commercially. These considerations strike him home. But eschatology and empire were not incompatible. Jasper succeeded in getting Britain to open a consulate in Jerusalem in 1838. Not by coincidence, this was the same year Britain pushed into the region through the signing of the Barthelemy Treaty. God and Mammon mixed rather well. Lady Palmerston, the wife of the Foreign Secretary, with whom he apparently formed his opinions, read the fall of Acre through her Bible. It cannot be an accident that all these things should have so turned out. My impression is that it is the restoration of the Jews and the fulfillment of the prophecies. It is certainly very curious, and Acre seems to have fallen down like the walls of Jericho, and Abraham's army dispersed like the countless hosts that were enemies of the Jews, as we see in the Old Testament. So you're getting a lot of these similar arguments today, and this was, 200 years ago, almost? Yeah, August 1840. It should be pointed out that this was a wholly Gentile, Christian, white Anglo-Saxon fantasy, in which actual Jews living in the Middle East or elsewhere played no active role. That's why it's such an anti-Semitic belief, because it's like using Jews as, like, for your own religious prophecy, I guess, using them as pawns. Lord Palmerston himself clearly saw the pulverization of Acre as a sign not of the end times, but of a new era of prosperity. No longer would the cotton industry be cramped by a lack of markets. After what he called the prostration of Muhammad Ali, Palmerston restated his general philosophy. We must unremittingly endeavor to find in other parts of the world new wants for the produce from our industry. The world is large enough, and the wants of the human race ample enough to afford a demand for all we can manufacture. But it is the business of the government to open and to secure the roads for the merchant. It was in this scheme that the Jews had a role to play. In another letter, and this document has been cited relatively often, Palmerston told Ponsonby to convince the Sultan to encourage the Jews to return and settle in Palestine because the wealth which they would bring with them would increase the resources of the Sultan's dominions. Moreover, a Jewish settlement would serve as a check upon any future evil designs by Muhammad Ali or his successor. That sounds very familiar. A check on Arab evil. It's like when Netanyahu says it's a battle of what did he say? Between children of light and children of darkness. Maybe that was someone else. But, I mean, I could stop every time we hear this familiar argument. Throughout the Eastern crisis, Palmerston again and again dictated this rationale in letters to his ambassador. A return of the Jews to Palestine would implant a great number of wealthy capitalists. If the Sultan would accept them, he would earn the friendship of powerful classes in this country. The UK, that is. The capital and the industry of the Jews would much increase his revenue and add greatly to the strength of his empire. We can here see a kind of brain scan of imperialist Zionism. Because the Jews would be tied to the metropole, giving Palestine to them would help unfetter capitalist development and prevent the rise of new recalcitrant challenges in the region. I don't know what that word means, recalcitrant. I'm going to look it up real quick. Whenever I come across a word I don't know, unless I don't have my phone on me, I like to look it up because I'm a nerd and I love expanding my vocabulary. Recalcitrant. Having an obstinately uncooperative attitude towards authority or discipline. Okay, so I was talking about, I guess, rebels in the region. Prevent the rise of new rebels in the region. As a measure of just how mainstream this scheme had become, the Times ran an article on 17th August while Charles Napier was running up and down the Lebanese coast on the Gorgon, explaining that a Jewish settlement of Palestine would function as a breastwork against the further encroachments of lawless tyranny and of social degeneracy. In short, it would be advantageously employed for the interests of civilization in the East. On the ground, the advanced detachments of Zionism were formed by officers in the imperial bureaucracy. Some of them came fresh from the battlefield. A colonel by the name of Churchill, Charles Henry, distant relative of the more famous Winston, commanded the British forces that marched into Damascus in early 1841, assembled various dignitaries in a hall, and gave a speech. Yes, my friends, there was once a Jewish people, famous in arts and renowned in war. These beautiful plains and valleys, which are now tenanted by the wild and wandering Arab, on which desolation has fixed her iron stamp, once reveled in the luxuriance of their fertile and abundant crops, and resounded with the songs of the daughters of Zion. May the hour of Israel's deliverance be near at hand. This Churchill was well aware that there was no, as he put it, strong notion among Europe's Jews to return to Palestine. The desire of Jews to stay where they lived frustrated him. Equally frustrating, his government stuck to the policy of keeping the Ottoman Empire intact under British guardianship and custody. So again, it's kind of, we see this similar dynamic playing out in modern day, I think, with Chuck Schumer. He said on his book tour that he's going on that his job is to keep Democrats Zionists or keep America Zionist or something. And they keep speaking for a lot of Jews who are in Brooklyn, but like the overwhelming majority of those Jews voted for Samdani for mayor. And what am I trying to say here? Just like the idea, and like some like people like Chuck Schumer can't wrap their head around that, but the idea that, you know, Brooklyn Jews, they want to live in Brooklyn. The Brooklyn people, they're not Israelis. I feel like, just as someone who's not Jewish, but if someone were to, for example, say that I need, as a black man, need to have loyalty to Kenya or some random country in Africa instead of loyalty to America, loyalty to Minnesota, where I'm from, I would find that to be very racist. So I feel like it's very anti-Semitic to expect Jews living in America to have loyalty to Israel, the Israeli government. Anyway, where were we? Equally frustrating, his government stuck to the policy of keeping the Ottoman Empire intact under British guardianship and custody. He wished to see it broken up, and Jewish colonization of Palestine would be just the right hammer. In a long letter to Moses Montefiore, president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, sent from Damascus, where he was installed as consul, Churchill exhorted him to convince his fellow Jews to go to Palestine and perhaps Syria too. You would end by obtaining the sovereignty of at least Palestine. I am perfectly certain that these countries must be rescued from the grasp of ignorant and fanatical rulers, that the march of civilization must progress, and its various elements of commercial prosperity must be developed. It is needless to observe that such will never be the case under the blundering and despotism of the Turks or the Egyptians. Syria and Palestine, in a word, must be taken under European protection and governed in the sense in accordance to the spirit of European administration. It must ultimately come to this. Churchill envisioned a Jewish entity in Palestine under the protection of Britain and its allies, armed for the defense against the incursion of Bedouin Arabs. Another man who hurried into Palestine at this auspicious moment was George Gawler. Having just relocated from South Australia, where he had been governor, he penned a pamphlet titled Tranquilization of Syria and the East, Practical Suggestions in Furtherance. Oh my god, this is a long title. Okay, another man who hurried into Palestine he penned a pamphlet titled Tranquilization of Syria and the East, Practical Suggestions in Furtherance of the Establishment of Jewish Colonies in Palestine, the most sober and sensible remedy for the miseries of Asiatic Turkey. So we're seeing a lot of white saviorism, thinking like we need to have this colony to civilize the savages, the Arab savages, which, if you're familiar with, I think is it Heart of Darkness? I don't know, but this idea of the white man's burden, it was also the same justification that was used to justify slavery, was that we were civilizing them and saving them from the savages of Africa. So it's all the same white supremacist logic. He traveled in Palestine in the early 1840s and somehow managed to perceive it as a fertile country, 9/10 of which lie desolate. What? The land was empty, save for a few unlettered and restless Badawi now and then encountered in deserted cities and thorn-covered plains. Solution: replenish the deserted towns and fields of Palestine with the energetic people, the Jews, who would turn it into a flourishing marketplace under the watch of a naval force frequently on the coast, the British steamer, that is. A friend of Palmerston, E.L. Milford, likewise imagined Palestine as barren and desolate. Jewish colonization would bring blessings on England and be felt in the wretched hearts and homes of the poor manufacturers of Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow. Of particular importance, it would facilitate fossil fuel entrenchment in the region and beyond. An independent Jewish state under British protection would place the management of our steam communication entirely in our hands and would place us in a commanding position in the Levant from whence to check the process of encroachment, to overawe open enemies, and, if necessary, to repel their advance. Such was the formula derived from the events of 1840. This, then, was the moment of conception for two interrelated principles. One, no people exist in Palestine, which now the argument is Palestine was never even a country or area until 1848, which is also, I mean, this book shows how BS that is. Also, I think in, what is it? Oh my god. I'm blanking on the name. Othello. They mentioned Palestine. So it's been around for centuries. Millennia, maybe even. Two, the land must be taken with the force of technology running on fossil fuels. As for the former, contemporary Zionist debate, who first came up with the slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land, but there is a consensus that it happened around the year 1840. Some point to an article Shaftesbury wrote in the Times in 1839, where he used the phrase, earth without people, people without land. Earth without people sounds perhaps slightly more chilling today. Others give the honor to his fellow Christian Zionist, Alexander Keith, who went on an expedition to Palestine in 1839 and somehow managed to return with the impression that this was a country without a people, crying out for the arrival of a people without a country. The cities and towns of Palestine were desolate without an inhabitant, from Gaza to Al-Khalil, which is such a oxymoron, saying the cities were without an inhabitant. How can they be? Why were there cities there then? It's so, when you think about it, it's so ridiculous. Anyway, from Gaza to Al-Khalil, all Keith could observe were deserted sites and ruined villages, not one of them being inhabited. But now a miracle had transpired. As if commissioned by the Lord, Keith wrote of Akka, a bomb penetrated a magazine of powder stored up for defense and raised the arsenal in the air, as if to show that the time was come that the last fortress in Palestine should cease, and strewed it stone by stone upon the ground. Strewed it stone by stone upon the ground. Why does it say that twice? Anyway, as if the times too were not distant when the hands of strangers should find other work and build up the ruined walls in another form, Acre fell to the lot of a tribe of Israel. It now became a persistent theme of British commentary on Palestine that no people lived there. Shaftesbury informed Palmerston that Jewish colonization would be the cheapest and safest mode of supplying the waste of these depopulated regions. The Morning Post published a typical article claiming that Syria and Palestine are depopulated, voids in which the sons of the Arabian wilderness had failed to establish themselves and maintain their nationality. So we're seeing again what we see today, the media being complicit in this genocide and complicit in this forced dislocation, and also doublespeak, if you're familiar with that term, saying two things that are opposite. So it says Syria and Palestine are depopulated in one sentence, so saying that there's no one there. But then it's saying that the Arabian sons had failed to establish themselves and maintain their nationality, which means that there are people there, they just didn't establish themselves, which, whatever that means, and maintain their nationality, whatever that means. So you see the media kind of trying to justify it, but also, like, if there's no people there, then how could there be people there that didn't maintain their nationality? And once you really, like, start thinking deeper into these headlines, like the New York Times is notorious for, like, doing stuff like this, where they literally published a correction saying that a baby or a child that has was close to starving to death or starved to death, I don't remember, but had a pre-existing condition. And it's like, that makes it like this child we starved was already sick and we blocked them getting medicine. Like, sorry, I don't know if this is too rambly, but it's just the New York Times really pisses me off. All Western media pisses me off because they do stuff like this. Anyway, the year 1840 was here calculated to match a biblical prophecy of Jewish restoration. Such fusion of eschatology, I'm going to look up what that word is real quick. I turned my phone off. I'll look it up later. I'm going to turn it back in. Such fusion of eschatology and empire became very much in vogue after Akka, as in perhaps the most peculiar tract to emerge from this moment, an anonymously authored 350-page mismatch of exegesis, realpolitik, and steam fetishism called The Kings of the East. Here, too, Palestine was said to have few inhabitants, and the fall of Akka was hailed as a divine intervention by means of steam, the pillar of British power. As proof of the metaphysical significance of Akka, the author quoted a first-hand report of how the town is a complete mass of ruins. Not a house in the place, however small, has escaped the fury of our shot. Everything bears the most ample witness of the matchless precision of our guns. Praise the Lord, thousands of her garrison numbered with the dying and the dead, ergo restoration was imminent. This author alleged that the Jews are commencing to return to Judea. 2 verses of the Bible shed special light on this process. At the opening of the 18th chapter of Isaiah, in the King James Version, we read, Woe to the land shadowing with wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, that sendeth ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of bulrushes upon the waters, saying, Go, ye swift messengers, to a nation scattered and peeled. What kind of vessels did the prophet talk about here? Patently, he must have had British steamboats in mind. So again, we're seeing biblical analysis being used to justify what's going to become mass displacement and ethnic cleansing. They were the ones sending ambassadors by the sea to open Palestine for the Jews. From this, the author inferred a novel prophecy. Britain will issue a proclamation guaranteeing to all Jews who will return to Syria their protection. So I'm going to probably do a Bible reading for one of these reading for Gaza's. I have a lot of things I want to read for this series. I think I want to get through this one. I have a few things queued up, but we will be reading the Bible together, and I'll give my interpretation. Once I start getting more people to join my live streams, it would be fun, I think, to do it live with you guys, but yeah. The mania also crossed the Atlantic to the United States of America. In the weeks before the fall of Akka, one influential, relatively progressive periodical, The Western Messenger, knew which way the wind was blowing. Now that steamships ride in the Bay of Alexandria and steamboats break the waters of the Nile and the roar of steam cars dashing over railways is heard, it is not morally certain that the Muslim power has ceased. The time has come to give the Jews possession of Palestine. They would take and defend the land with military might and send all sorts of profit flowing back to the West. But the first American Zionist of import, who, unlike nearly all of his British counterparts, also happened to be Jewish, was Mordecai Emanuel Noah. In 1844, he delivered a discourse on the restoration of the Jews. He never visited Palestine, but he seems to have learned from British travelers that the land is now desolate, although he did relay that olives and olive oil are everywhere found, and wheat and corn and cotton and tobacco grow in the plains and hills, and grapes of the largest kind flourish everywhere. Now, great and important revolutions were underway in that land. Noah latched on to the view that the demise of Ali heralded the organization of a powerful government in Judea, and he implored the U.S. to take it under its wings. So we're seeing how the U.S. kind of starts becoming involved in this imperialist project. Noah likewise read Isaiah 18. He deepened the exegesis, one notch by reading it directly in Hebrew and finding that the prophet called the vessel gomi. This Hebrew word could also mean an impetus, a forcible propelling power. Further evidence that the prophet referred to steam. But in Noah's reading, the steam power would be American, not British. The land lying beyond the rivers of Ethiopia is America. And the vessels, our steam vessels, with a divine mission to settle the Jews in Palestine. The discovery and application of steam will be found to be a great auxiliary in the promotion of this interesting experiment. It placed American Jews within a few days' travel of Jerusalem. Our Mediterranean and Levant triad, hitherto much neglected, will be revived, affording facilities to reach Palestine from this country direct. Reverting to the default view that no economic activities were occurring as of now, Noah anticipated that the ports of the Mediterranean will be again open to the busy hum of commerce. The fields will again bear the fruitful harvest. So this also sounds very similar to Manifest Destiny, which was pretty much the logic that was used, that America needs to expand westward and expand civilization westward, and it led to the genocide. That logic led to the genocide of the Native Americans. So we're seeing this, similar imperialist talking points and themes. He looked forward to a future when the whole territory surrounding Jerusalem, including the villages of Hebron, Savat, Tyre, also Beirut, Jaffa, and other ports of the Mediterranean, will be occupied by enterprising Jews. The valleys of the Jordans will be filled by agriculturalists from the north of Germany, Poland, and Russia. Merchants will occupy the seaports, and the commanding positions within the walls of Jerusalem will be purchased by the wealthy and pious of our brethren. Some prophecies do come true. All right, so we'll end it there. The next section is called A Structure, Not an Event. We're about a third of the way done with the book. Actually, exactly a third of the way done. I think there's two other things I want to, reading for Gaza, I want to post before we go into our next session. But please feel free. This is a great book. I'm definitely going to have to read it multiple times and annotate it as well. So if you guys, it's by Andreas Mann if you want to support them and get your own copy. It's pretty small. It's only like 120 pages, but a lot of good information in there. All right, stay cozy.